Okay. I am Te Arakanen Ha'araka'a, name which means a chamber of the suffering servant, the lion's rebuke. Daddy God about to spank the world, and specifically he's about to spank the Americas. It's going to be a little bit of a long presentation on why, and really, to be honest about it, it's like the wise men trying to figure out what the elephant is, right? They're blind, but one of them grabs the tail, one of them grabs the leg, another grabs the trunk. Well, I think I might have the trunk and the tail. So we're going to start with this guy as a basis here. He's a little bit excitable, and I think I managed to avoid the horrendous doctrine he has, but for what I need, his video is faster than me doing it myself.
Because the truth will be revealed today. Now, what you're
It
looking
will.
at is the cover from the 1611 version of the King James Version. Yes, the 1611 edition of the King James Version, the very first version. Yes, the very first version of the King James Version. Let me repeat that. And the reason I'm here is because I'm showing you the actual cover. And as you can see, the cover even contains the name of our father, the Hebrew name for our father, Yahuwah. But when you look at the actual cover, this is what you see. So it says the Holy Bible containing the Old Testament and the New. But as you can see, the word containing isn't spelled like it's normally spelled today.
Nope,
And you can
nope.
even see the word original is not spelled the way it is either.
No,
And
that's
when you look at this
different
version,
too.
you start to notice something very interesting and suspicious about it. Indeed, because when you look at this word majesties, there is a letter that is not there, and that letter is the letter J, which we will be talking about and covering even more. But this is just the covering that I want you to see. As you can see, 1611, and we're going to go to the actual table of contents, and we're actually going to be reading from this version so that you can see the truth for yourself and so that you can be deceived no more. Now, upon first looking at this version, the very first thing you see about the 1611 version in the King James Version, and yes, this is the King James Version, this is the original King James Version that they used, the
Loves the
very
sound of
first
his own
one.
voice a
As you
little
can
bit.
see, here's the table of contents, but you start to notice something. You start to notice that some of the wordings and the way that they used to spell words back then, 400 years ago, is not how they spell words today. As you can see, it says the names in order of all the books of the Old and New Testament with the number of their chapters. Well, books isn't spelled like that today. And when you look at some of the chapters, they're not spelled like the way we spell it today either. For example, Deuteronomy is spelled with an IE instead of a Y in this version, but there's something else. There is a letter that is missing that is not here. Because when you look at Joshua, or what is commonly known as Joshua in this version, there is no letter J in this version. When you
Nope.
look at Jeremiah, there is no letter J. It is only a letter I. And when you look at the book of Job, there is no letter
No J in
J.
the
It is only
1611.
the letter I. And this book also contains the Apocrypha, which is books that they've taken out of Scripture in newer versions of the King James Version to keep you enslaved to just the 66 books, and also to keep these books hidden from you because they don't want you to know the true history. But that's another topic for another video. But I just wanted to show you and let you know that when you look at this version, and we're going to actually look at it, even the book of John, there is no letter J. It's a letter I right there. Where is that coming
Mm-hmm.
from? Where is the letter J? As you see, they used the archaic English or the Old Middle English back then during that time. And as you see in the actual scripture itself, you see that in the King James Version itself, that what? There is no letter J whatsoever. The letter J is nowhere to be found. As you can see, it says, after this, there was a feast of what should save the Jews in the original King James. Well, in the 1611 version, it has the letter I. And by the way, the letters I and J were originally pronounced as the letter Y, so the Y sound.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see right
Mm-hmm.
here the name of the Messiah. What it says, instead of saying Jesus, it says it with an I, or Isus, or Jesus as another way of pronouncing that. And as you can see, the spelling is different. This is how they originally spelled it. But there's no letter J. Can somebody tell me where the letter J is in this version? And if you look here, you'll even see that there is no letter J right there. And even verse 6 too even says what? No letter J right there whatsoever. So if you keep going, and if we keep going, when we see the name of the Messiah, you see that what? No letter J. It's spelled with a letter I. And this chapter is all talking about searching the scriptures, which is what we are doing. As you can see in verse 8, there is no letter J. His name is spelled with an I. My hope is that you're seeing just where salvation really comes from. Because the truth will be revealed today, and somebody's going to get this. Now, I'm here at the online etymology dictionary, and what we're going to be covering right now is the origins of the letter J. Because like I said, if the letter J is only a few hundred years old, and if we've just
Mm-hmm.
proven earlier ago that the King James Version itself, there was no letter J in there, then how is the name of our Messiah Jesus when there was no letter J 400 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago? And it's time we...
Well, that's going to be his sticking point of doctrine and, quite frankly, witchcraft. Because his opinion is that to get God to answer your prayers, you have to pronounce his name properly. No, your heart has to be towards him. And then it has to be something he wants. Right? I mean, my heart can be towards God, and I can pray for him to put a bunch of vipers in here with me. And it's like, boy, those will bite you. No.
see that and understand that. Now it says, and I'm here at the etymology dictionary itself, but it says the letter J, the 10th letter of the English alphabet, pronounced J as in K for K, but formerly written out as JY, rhyming with I and corresponding to French G. One of the most stable English letters, it has almost always the same sound. It is a late comer to the alphabet, and to be exact, it's the newest letter of the alphabet, the last letter to be added, and originally had no sound value. The letter itself began as a scribal modification of Roman I and continental medieval Latin. The scribes added a hook to small I, especially in the final position in a word or Roman numeral, to distinguish it from the strokes of other letters. The dot on the I, and thus the J, and the capitalization of the pronoun I are other solutions to the same problems. Now, this is the important part, and you will see in English, J was used as a Roman numeral throughout Middle English, but the letter Y was used to spell words ending in I sound, so J was not needed to represent a sound. And that's something we went over, and when we saw Psalm 64, and we saw our Father's name being spelled in the original KJV as IAH, well, that I was pronounced as a letter Y, and you'll see in the KJV today in Psalm 64 that our Father's name is spelled Yah, or JAH, but it's not pronounced as J, it's pronounced as a Y. But it goes on to say, instead, it, as in the letter J, was introduced into English circa 1600 to 1640 to take up the consonantal sound that had evolved from the Roman I since late Latin times. In Italian, G was used to represent this, but in other languages, J took the job. This usage is attested earliest in Spanish, where it was in place before 1600. No word beginning with J is of Old English derivation, and that's something we just went over too, because I just taken you to the 1611 version of the KJV, and you saw no letter J, or no word containing the letter J, because it simply did not exist, because it was introduced into the English circa 1600 to 1640. Well,
And actually, in practical terms, he won't get to it. But the English dictionaries did not distinguish between words beginning in I and J until the 19th century, so the 1800s. And to the best of my information, it's in the 1800s, where both English and French, the two languages spoken in British North America, pick up this hard J sound. The other European languages is either a Y like in German, or it's an H, like in Spanish, but only in English and French, in British North America. After about 1800, the J picks up this J sound.
Guess what? In the 1611 version, there was no letter J whatsoever. So how?
It is, however, in Mexico and Peru that we must look for the most enlightened and most wealthy of the Indian race. Again, it is, however, in Mexico and Peru that we must look for the most enlightened and most wealthy of Indian race. On the representations of Montesini, who traveled in South America, the learned Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, as I have said before, wrote his famous work La Esperanza de Israel, which he...
Okay, first of all, I just love this guy, Kurumeowa. He's got a great channel on YouTube, tons of videos. He likes to dig in to the original source materials. So whatever little bits of issue he might have regarding his understanding of various doctrines, he's digging into the original stuff to figure out what the facts are as best as he can. So I absolutely love this guy. But also pay attention. We're listening, and we're going to get to it, the 1650s. Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, who's taking this up.
Published in Amsterdam in 1650, endeavoring with great zeal to prove that the Indians in North and South America were the descendants of the missing tribes.
A rabbi.
Cromwell, to whom the work was dedicated, was greatly interested in the evidences produced on that occasion.
And who's Cromwell? Well, he's the guy in the British interregnum. The Protestant democracy that existed briefly between Charles I and Charles II.
Montesini, traveling through the province of Quito, I believe it was Quito really, found that his Indian guide was a Jew, and pursuing his inquiries, discovered that immense numbers lived behind the Cordilleras. Francis, the name of his guide, admitted to Montesini that his God was called Adonai, and that he acknowledged Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his ancestors, and they claimed to have descended from the tribe of Reuben. Alright, so you guys are hearing this? The tribe of Reuben.
I'm hearing it.
Acosta contends that they have a tradition relative to the deluge, that they preserve the rite of circumcision, they offer the first fruits, and in Peru, they eat the Paschal lamb. They believe in the resurrection and clothe the dead with the riches. Ickapage. Lopez de Gomara says that some of the men, and not all, are circumcised. Acosta continues, the Mexicans point out the various stations as their ancestors advanced into their country, and it is precisely the route which they must have held had they been immigrants from Asia.
And that's when they uncovered the famous Decalogue stone, a black piece of slate. Actually, it's alabaster, but there's alabaster all over the world. Very soft, black sandstone with a priestly figure and characters on every single surface.
A few of these letters look like standard Hebrew, but most of them don't. But working from the clue that a few of them look like standard Hebrew, John McCarty, again, that was Episcopalian minister in Newark, was able to decipher the rest of the letters and discover that the text here is basically an abridged version of the Ten Commandments or Decalogue, written in Hebrew language, but in this funny alphabet. And over the head of this robed and bearded figure is the name Moshe, or Moses in Hebrew. So presumably this is Moses giving the Ten Commandments.
the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near
Oh,
those
no.
earthworks, and he found a
Fox.
wooden coffin made of
You
oak.
can't trust anything they
opened up
say.
the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box that was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here at first they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the Ten Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew, they said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismissed the findings. They found it in Israel, and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they
Trust
couldn't
the
argue.
experts.
This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee, since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement. Many years later, a scholar took it out of the box, looked at it, and went, oh my gosh, it's upside down. It's Phoenician, ancient Hebrew. So what's going on here? What is that about? Where is that history?
Yes, where?
Right, so in this book, it's going to basically correlate a lot of the information we've already gone before in past videos. So let's just go into it so you can see what I'm talking about. So we go to page 118, relationship to the Aztecs and Eastern tribes. YHWH, or Yahweh, or Hawa. Today, the antiquarian may lay aside his musty parchments of antiquity and in the heart of the big Everglades, study the history of an ancient people through living authors. Yahweh, Jehovah, or Hawa, monotone, yet rhythmical, the brown-faced singers, again, brown-faced singers, chanted the hymn. Over and over again were the words repeated by the Seminole choir, till the word Yahweh, mystical and the centuries past, dwelt with the listener. None but a Hebrew scholar would have caught the word with an understanding of its meaning.
And why is that? Because in the 1800s, the letter J with a Jehovah sound was slipped into the language. So even if you were reading the Bible, you wouldn't know about Yahweh. You'd only know about Jehovah.
The occasion was a 4th of July celebration when the retired Reverend W.M. Gray was visiting the Seminole Mission at Immokalee, situated near the western border of the Florida Everglades. The Indians, full of confidence and kindly feeling, had consented to sing, and here appeared the wonderful, yes, startling observation made by Bishop Gray. Yahweh is the Hebrew word meaning Yehovah or Hawa, a word held in such awe by the children of Israel, and as claimed by scholars too sacred to pass the lips of a man, that even its correct pronunciation is unknown. Alright, so they don't know how it's pronounced. So Hawa, right? There was no V's in ancient Paleo Hebrew. If you go to the letter of the Vav, they have the V today, it was Wa, the sound. Alright, so let's continue. It says, today in the weird fastnesses of the Everglades, a band of wild Indians chant the name of the great Jehovah or Hawa in the Hebrew tongue, a name that is meaningless in its original form to thousands of educated Americans.
And we know why.
When questioned by Bishop Gray as to the meaning of the sacred word, the Indian answered, God, white man's God. The question now appeals to the scientist, to the antiquarian, and to the theologian. From whence came the Seminoles' knowledge of the word? If you really go into the history, you would see there is no African ancestry. Familia, ampitu watchte. All right, so I just want to pick up where we left off in the last video, in the last part, part 5. We were talking about how, we have the habitat.
And we're going to say that it's not always that there's no African ancestry for a lot of the darker skinned people in the Americas, because there was some transatlantic slave trade going honestly both ways. But a heck of a lot of the darker skinned people in the Americas who wound up enslaved, they were here before Columbus came.
And the environment here in the Americas, we have the tropics, or the burning zones, as you're going to see. They call it these burning tropical zones, where there would be people of color or dark-skinned people, or as you know them as so-called Negroes or blacks. All right.
America, BC, by Barry Fell. He was a New Zealander. He was one of our people. He was of a...
This guy does have a definite doctrinal problem. He thinks the Shemites are white. It's the Japhites. And honestly, we can't say when it was the Japhites became white. I mean, was it right in the days of Noah? Was it later? Is it only part of the Japhites? And then, honestly, afterwards, in the past, let's say 2,000 years, the opportunity for everyone to mix together so thoroughly that you can't tell who is who anymore, at least not by the color of anyone's skin, right? I mean, you can take the darkest of the darkest people, and if they want to be all where the white women at for a couple of generations, their children aren't going to be so dark anymore in a couple of generations. Goes even faster the other way. But, just forgive this guy for what he doesn't know, and, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, or the bathwater out with the baby, or whatever it is.
Shemitic origin, okay? And he's passed on now. He was a tremendous scientist and investigator, okay? This is the cover of his book, which is available at Barnes & Noble on your computer if you want to buy it. It's about $15 to $20 in hardback form, all right? This is the cover of what he put. Iberic, Iber, this is where the Zaragoza was, of the Zara, the son of Judah. Remember, we went into that with the kings and everything. And the Liberian and the Egyptian. And he's showing arrows from the Basque and the Celtic coming into the different portions of the United States, okay? And then he's telling you that the Algonquins spoke perfect Hebrew as their main language. Perfect Hebrew, not a flaw, all right?
Where's that? The Great Lakes.
Now, there's a book that I have available. It's $20. It's $22 if you're ordering it for postage and handling, $2, but it's $20.
This is old. Don't order it. It's probably more.
These are copies of engravings of prehistoric specimens from Michigan of the United States of America, the
Great
state
Lakes.
of Michigan. And this book is a tremendous piece of evidence, of pictorial evidences, to prove that ancient Ogham, right here, ancient Ogham, you see it looks like a nail, and then two nails down, a nail across, and a nail sideways. In ancient Ogham, that means Yahweh. Okay? Also, I have the book available. I also have another book called The Mystic Symbol of the Mound of the Michigan Mound Builders, which is 274 pages. And on it, they have at the top the mystic symbol. And the people who deciphered it, they knew Yahweh, but they didn't know who Yahweh, they didn't know they were Yahweh's people. And it's got the ancient mystic symbol. There's the symbol right here on the book, which matches this symbol right here, which is also on the front of this book right here. That is ancient Ogham, and it means Yahweh. Very important. Okay, this is very important. Next, please. There was a philanthropist, Salfer, David Salfer, from down by Detroit. This is back in the late 1800s, who took a great interest in many of the items that were being discovered in Michigan, and he spent a considerable amount of money and interested in collecting these things and writing and making sure that they were preserved and photographed, especially around 1905, 1907, when pictures came into being in the late 1800s. They had pictures, of course, during the Civil War and that, but the cameras improved greatly as time went on. He had a great interest in the artifacts, the ancient artifacts of the ancient Ogham relics that were found in the state of Michigan, of course, where we reside. So we're very fortunate, aren't we? Okay? And it was due to this man here, and I give him all the credit for his courage and his standability and stamina. Because of him, what you are going to see now has become available. You can see that there's a lot of copper spearheads and different copper slicing, filleting tools here that was discovered here, okay? It's very hard. There's the name of Yahweh. The mark of Yahweh is on the bottom. All of these relics, somewhere on them, it's pretty hard to decipher and see them at this time. There's the mark. There's Yahweh's name right here. There's Yahweh's name right here. There's now Yahweh's name right here, okay? Yahweh's name is on almost all of these relics that have been discovered in the late 1800s or extremely early 1900s in the state of Michigan. Next, please.
You got more Yahweh. Let's see where you get all this.
Well, yes, this is ancient text. That is correct. And this is the Monhegan stone, found by Augustus C. Hamlin of Bangor. This is in Bangor, in 1856 on the Mohegan Island near the coast of Maine. This is an East Coast artifact. I just threw this in here because of the name, okay? It is cut out of a slab of rock, illustrated in paper of the Reverend Dr. Campbell on a recently discovered relics of America's mound builders, okay? And this is the Transaction of Royal Society of Canada of 1898. Thank you.
So, the Royal Society of Canada in 1898 had at least some awareness that there were First Nations who were Yahweh worshippers. They might not have understood the name was Yahweh, perhaps conveniently, but the evidence was coming out.
Thank you. This is part of the Savage individual collection, private collection. These are copper coins near Big Rapids, Mecosa County, Michigan, October 9, 1898. These coins were found, and on them were carved little pictures of, like the person I showed you beforehand. There's the name of Yahweh again. All these coins, there's Yahweh's name, there's Yahweh's name, there's Yahweh's name. All of these
Holy
coins
crap, it's
are
like an
copper
Oprah show
coins
episode.
in ancient Ogham. You know, what I'm showing you just here should absolutely make archaeologists and everyone else foam at the mouth.
It should. It
But
should.
all of this stuff, as I found out later, was told by the government to hide these things and warehouse them and not tell the masses that they exist. Okay.
No,
Here's
really?
Is this the second? This is the reverse side of the coins, okay? You saw one side of the coin, just like on the coins, those lead slugs, because they took away your gold and silver and gave you a bunch of lead slugs, etc. This is the other side of the coins. Look at the delicate work here that has been done by the metallurgists of a white Shemitic people who not only knew and read Ogham, but they inscribed Ogham so small upon these coins that were found in the state of Michigan. Next, please. Now, the question I must ask, and that you've always got to keep in back of your right ear and left ear, why is not this being introduced in Michigan's historical classes at Michigan State University, Central Michigan, Michigan State, and elsewhere? Well,
anywhere.
what's going on here? What's happening here? Well, you know, there are some things that you're to know and some things they don't want you to know. And they surely don't want you to know that you're the Native Americans, if you're a white Semitic people, known as white Western European peoples today, of your ancestors, because then maybe you won't have to put permits on your boats and cars. Maybe you'll be able to go fishing and catching all the fish you want to catch. And maybe they'll have to turn over the casinos to us.
That's a little bit, snarky's not quite the right word, but yeah, really there is an issue though, because there's a heck of a lot of people with an ancestral claim to the land who are told, no, you don't have any claim, you're not indigenous whatsoever.
In 1973, Dr. Joseph Mahon of Atlanta, Georgia, an expert in ancient Indian ethnology, or a study of different cultures, of the southeastern Indians of the United States, displayed pottery uncovered from the waters around the Bahamas. He also discussed Indian legends, including that of the Yucas, stating that they had migrated to the area of Florida and Georgia from the region of the Bahamas. According to their legends, the islands sank beneath the sea and they fled for their lives. These same Yucas later migrated to the Oklahoma Territory, where they eventually settled down. Amazingly, they show strong evidence that they had contact with the Old World in historic times. They have a custom which is unique among the American Indians. They are racially and linguistically, different from their neighbors. Every year on the 15th day of the sacred month of harvest, in the fall they make a pilgrimage. For 8 days they live in booths with roofs open to the sky, covered with branches and leaves and foliage, and during this festival they dance around the sacred fire and call upon the name of Yahweh. Whoa. Now, does that ring a bell? Who else used to have 8 days and the booths that they used to make? Weren't they called the Hebrews of old? Yeah. Oh, Cristiano Edward Rivero and John James von Schutte in Peruvian Antiquities, in their book dated 1857, point out that after the most thorough examination and minute comparison, the religious rites of the American Indians plainly present many points of agreement with those of the Hebrew people. These two authors, in 1857, continued, like the Hebrews, the Indians offered their first fruits, they kept their new moons, and the feast of harvest at the end of September or in the beginning of October. They divide the year into 4 seasons corresponding with the Hebrew festivals.
Jubilee, according to the Jubilee of Israel. Dr. Betty, in speaking of the festival of the first fruits by the Indians west of the Ohio, says, "At this ceremony 12 of their old men divide a deer into 12 parts, and these men hold up the venison and fruits with their faces to the east and acknowledge in the bounty of God to them." A singular and close imitation of the ceremonies and sacrifices of the temple. The doctor further says they have another feast which looks like the Passover. Again, the Passover. Sir Alexander Mackenzie, in his tour to the northwest coast, says that the Chippewayan Indians have a tradition among them that they originally came from another country, inhabited by very wicked people, and had traversed a great lake, which was in one place narrow and shallow, and full of islands, where they had suffered great misery. And a further tradition has it that 9 parts of their nation out of 10 passed over the river. The Mexican affirm that 7 tribes or houses passed from the east to the wilderness.
This is a green slate of the Soffer collection near Detroit, Wayne County, Michigan, January 8, 1909. It is a total story in picture of the flood. Of the flood.
Biblical account.
In ancient Ogham. There's harmony. This is creation. This is creation. This is a deluge. You see the rain coming down? There's buildings over here. You see the people here? They're in trouble. Oh my gosh, there's a catastrophe. Their hands are up in the air. You see the waves of water? See the waves of water? Now this was really wonderful. This shows here 40 days and 40 nights. 40 squares, 40 squares. It shows an ark, and on the bottom it shows the ark landing somewhere, and animals are coming off the ark, and people are rejoicing over here. There's ancient Ogham and inscription upon this green slate of the Soffer collection. 20, this is 21, and what it is, it somewhat resembles in memories of Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. And what it is Elijah took on the prophets of Baal, and in ancient Ogham and hieroglyphics, it is the contest between the evil priest and Elijah, who was victorious over the evil priest. Very powerful. And to make sure they got the name of Yahweh in ancient Ogham right on the bottom of this black slate. Next, please. 9. There's Yahweh at the top. Everything starts with Yahweh. This is a very beautiful situation, and it just amazes me at how much information has been available out there that has been hidden deliberately,
very deliberately
from the people. But it's not being hidden any longer, because Yahweh said everything is to be revealed, and what? And told unto you, so you know and understand what it's all about. Now this slate has to do with the Tower of Babel, okay, tape number 8. So you see, it has a story and a pictorial ancient Ogham history of the Tower of Babel. Next, please.
This is the Smithsonian Annual Report, 1882-1883. This is John Wesley Howell. This is an original copy. John Wesley Howell in 1789. Again, this is the, I'm sorry, Powell. This is the director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institute. He said this: artifacts found prior to Christopher Columbus's arrival would be considered illegitimate by the Smithsonian. Only the savage Indian culture would be observed, and this created the artificial barrier to science. Only the savage. Science was colluding with government because of commerce, and religion was involved. Now, why do I tell you all this stuff? Not because I'm an Indian expert or anything else. You got to do your own homework. I just found out about this stuff. I'm amazed by it. I don't know what the answer is on this,
1850 that persons of American descent, in order to escape from the status of mulatto or colored person, had to prove that they were of free Indian descent,
In
unmixed
1850.
with African blood. That's what that means. The case is as follows. Amelia Marchant was challenged as a witness on the grounds that she was a person of color. So basically they were saying she was a Negro or a black person, not an Indian. They were trying to classify her and tag her as a person of color. When she was like, no, I'm Indian, stop calling me a person of color. I am from a tribe. I have a tribal name. It was argued on her behalf that her grandparents were free Indians, and also that her father, James Mitchell, was a Portuguese. So her father was a Portuguese? So why are they saying she's a person of color? And I'm trying to tell you, if you saw my other videos, there was a lot of so-called, Europeans that were, dark skin, or what you would call Moor, right? Or mulatto, right? Or a lighter skin, Negro. But they weren't all white Europeans that were coming and enslaving, and mixing with the Indians. As in this case, this was more likely a darker skinned European, this James Mitchell, if he was Portuguese. All right. Opponents said that Mitchell had associated with colored persons and was so considered. The verdict was in Marchant's favor. That is, that she was of free Indian ancestry, and that she had no African blood. No African blood. And they were trying to call her a colored, right? Colored. They were trying to call her colored. And she had no African blood. The Supreme Court reviewed the case and reversed the verdict in spite of the fact that Mitchells had paid no capitation tax charged to free colored people, and that James Mitchell had apparently married a white woman. The grounds for reversal were in part that many Indians had been enslaved and that the Mitchells came under the status of colored persons, apparently because they could not prove descent from free Indians in amity with South Carolina. If nothing else, this
If you can't prove that you're free, then you're a slave.
1850 case, all right, this one specific case he's telling you, Jack Forbes, illustrates that persons of American blood or American Indians, right, you could still be considered to be mulatto or colored persons in South Carolina, especially if a suspicion of African ancestry existed. So if you look a little bit Negro, or what they would consider Negro-ish or Negroid, right, or what they would consider an African, right, they would classify you mulatto or colored, and you would have to prove that you're Indian, even though you've already known that for thousands of years and hundreds of years with your family. In Georgia, which usually followed the lead of South Carolina, a wealthy Spanish Floridian of alleged mixed African and American ancestry was held to be a mulatto by a lower court. The higher court in 1856 reversed this decision and held him to be a white man. So you hear this? See how they're changing people's race, and court changing race? Does that make sense? You see how they're just playing with these tags? And all your ancestors, birth certificates, census records, and death certificates. I know it's all over your families. I know. I've seen the records. Show you things we probably never noticed, but now that we have a clear perspective of certain things, we can see what they were trying to say in these what we're going to read, these runaway slave advertisements, right? It says advertisements for runaway slaves occasionally contain information which sheds light on racial terms. The term mulatto is sometimes used for persons whose background cannot be documented, but very often American ancestry is specifically indicated. They're saying that these are American natives or aboriginals, who they're talking about when they're referencing a mulatto. In the following examples from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, references to Americans held as slaves will also be included, along with those specifically using the term mulatto. We shall begin with Virginia. 1737, 1738. Amos, a mulatto man, slave. He is about 6 feet high with broad face and shoulders, has bushy hair, and is a native of this country, although he has the countenance of a Madagascar. You hear that? All right, so a mulatto man slave, a native of this country, right? Remember, mulatto, they're just talking about American ancestry or an aboriginal.
And just so you can see that these advertisements are not fake, just want to show you some real ones. So it says here, $10 reward. Ran away from her subscriber on the 15th instant. A Negro girl named Nelly, 16 years of age. Stout built, rather short, yellow complexion. Again, yellow complexion. Who was called the yellow man? Yellow complexion, long Indian hair, curled before hold, but rather down looking. All right, Amy Cheston. This is from 1809.
1752, runaway from Somerset County, Maryland, a tall, slim mulatto man slave. Looks much like unto an Indian, and will endeavor to pass for such. Had with him a stripped Indian match coat. You hear that? So they're saying that this mulatto man looks much like unto an Indian. He looks very much like an Indian, and will try to pass like one. He is one. Hear what he's saying? Because if they classify him as an Indian, then he wouldn't be able to enslave him. But as a Negro, since that became almost synonymous with slave, then if you see him as a Negro, then it's okay for him to enslave him, and he has the right to, right in his mind. Right? 1772, ran away, a dark mulatto man, slave named Manuel, about 5 feet 9 inches high, 30 years of age, and has bushy hair. He has been used to go by water, has much the appearance of a sailor, and is a tolerably good shoemaker. He was born in the Spanish West Indies, speaks Spanish fluently.
Butte County, North Carolina, March 20, 1775. Runaway from the subscriber, a slave of the Indian breed. A tall, slim-made fellow with long, straight black hair. About 23 years of age.
1772, ran away from Cumberland, a mulatto man named Jim, who is a slave of the name of Cheshire, and very likely will call himself James Cheshire or Shink. He has long black hair resembling an Indian's. Okay. 1773, ran away with a Negro fellow named Fortune, a wench named Aminta, has much the look of an Indian, and is so, her mother having been brought from Spanish Main to Rhode Island, has long black hair. They were brought from Rhode Island.
Runaway from the subscriber in Albemarle, a mulatto slave called Sandy. Again, a mulatto slave called Sandy. We're just talking about American natives. About 35 years of age, his stature is rather low, inclining to corpulence, and his complexion light. Again, his complexion light. He is a shoemaker by trade, in which he uses his left hand principally. All right.
Way, an Indian man named Peter. Right away, right? An Indian man named Peter. 1740.
Straight up.
Started from the slope, Mayflower, a tall, rough Spanish Indian fellow. Also a well-said Spanish Negro fellow.
And lastly, I just want to show you something I haven't mentioned in this video, but it's something that it was very common in these
Tons
times.
of records.
And is that white Europeans, the only way they were able to come over here was if they did a contract, an indentured servant contract for 7 years. They weren't just getting free rights over to America. So when they were coming over here, they were servants, or as you want to call them, slaves, alongside the so-called Negro for many years until their contract was over. So just so you can see what I'm talking about, it says here, runaway from the subscriber, living in Kingstown, Queen Anne's County, Maryland, an Irish servant woman. Look at how her color of her skin. An Irish servant woman, indentured servant, named Martha Carr, about 24 years of age, of flesh complexion. Again, yes, white people were slaves slash indentured servants as well, along with the American Indian and so-called Negro. You have to realign your perspective of what you think history and the past is, especially when it comes to race, classification, indentured servants, and slavery.
Nottoway tribe a reservation group in Southern County, Virginia. In 1808, a partial census of the tribe identified, for example, Littleton Scholler, age 51, as an Indian, full-blood, with a white wife. In 1830 U.S. Census, however, Littleton's son Billy and Ned are listed as free people of color. All right, so his son, who has no African ancestry, right? Because he's saying he's full-blood dad, Indian, and a white mom or European, right? And they're calling his son a free people of color, All of the surviving full-blood Notaways are listed in the same manner. In 1844, an enumeration of free Negroes and mulattoes in Southampton County listed certain mulatto children, including Alex, Bob, Samuel, and Gideon Scholler, all children of a white mother. The Schollers do not appear to have had any African ancestry, but are regarded nonetheless as mulattoes. You see, they were calling them mulattoes without any African ancestry. Does this make sense to you? Most of the other Notaways with some African ancestry are classified as mulattoes or as free Negroes. Another case involves the Scott family, or Indians in Richmond, Virginia. William Scott was listed as an Indian in the tax rolls of the 1780s. By 1810, Billy Scott was called a free person of color, with 9 in his household. By 1850, the oldest William Scott in the area, age 49, was classified as an M in the census, as was his probable son. All other William Scotts were classified as either B or M, remember black or mulatto, in Henrico County. Thus, although the term mulatto ceases to be used in U.S. censuses, the general tendency is to use the term Negro to include all Indian, black persons who earlier would have been categorized under the former term. So you heard that, right? So eventually all these people who were listed as M, mulatto, who were Indians, right? They had no African ancestry, we just read, right? They were being classified as mulatto. These same people eventually will become Negro or black. All right, so I just want to show you one clear example here.
Remember, this is a good
one
one.
real example to bring you closer
Pay
to home
attention.
here, so you can have a foundation here of what I'm talking about when we're talking about these classifications and your ancestors and these records, right? So much love to Kiowa, who sent me his ancestors' records here, and we were able to put this all together to make sure it was him, and so we can see the different classifications that his ancestor went through. So the first one would be here from the census of 1880, right? This is from 1880, and the person's name is Guy Spalding, right? Let me just get a little closer. This is from line 13, right? And it says that he is, well, let's go to the classifications first. It says that W means white, B means black, MU means mulatto, C means Chinese, and I Indian, right? And then it talks about his age and the sex, right? So Guy Spalding, again, he's listed as MU, a mulatto, right? We just went over mulatto, right? So we got to dodge the hijack. Most likely he's an Indian, an American Indian. It says he's 30 years old here. So in 1880, minus 30 would be 1850. If he's almost, 31, then it would be 1849. So between 1849 and 1850, he was born. All right, remember that. Now, the interesting thing about here, Kiowa told me to look for as well, is that his family, you'll see the name like Delphia, Willie, Henry, Penny. You'll see Delphia a lot. They're listed as B or black. He's the only one in his family listed as mulatto. Why is everybody else listed as black? So that would make him black too, right? Or that would make them mulatto too, right? All right. So I mean, not necessarily, I know, but you'll see what I'm talking about. So again, 1880 census, he is listed as mulatto. Now let's go on. Now this is the census record. Let me back up of 1900. The 12th census of the United States says here, June 1900. And again, they have the same kind of classifications. It says here color, race, and B would be black. Again, so let's go down to Mr. Spalding. Again, 1900, line 83. Guy Spalding, head of the house, listed as B.
So he went from mulatto, now he's B or black,
Must
right?
have been out in the
Age
sun too
51.
long.
And birth year 1849. Like we said, he would be born in 1849 or 1850. So we are talking about the same person. And now he's listed as black in 1900. 20 years later, you will see his family again here, and they're also listed as black. You'll see the recurring name of Mitchell, right? These are all from North Carolina. They're all listed as black. Mitchell and all these families, Shipman. All right. Now let's move on. So now we got the census of, let me see, so it says the 15th census of the United States, 1930, 30 years later. Again, place of birth, it tells you about the father and mother, the classifications, the age, the color, all that, right? Sex. All right. So
This
we're going to
one's
go look at Guy
interesting.
Spalding. Again, here he is, line 57. Let me close in. Line 57. Guy Spalding, head of the household. Again, here goes Delphia, his wife, and other people in his family. It says that he is male, and then you can see a scribble where it says race or color. It's hard to tell what it says. IN, is that IN Indian or mulatto? MU, what is that? What does that mean? IN, what is this, right? But let's keep going. So he's Guy Spalding again, head of the household. Says he would be 82 years old here. All right, so it does match with the person we've been following. Now look at this, his place of birth, right? Now look at this, place of birth. It says that he is from North Carolina, but that his father and mother are full-blooded Cherokee. Now all of a sudden, they're listing his father and mother as full-blooded Cherokee. What does that make Mr. Guy Spalding? If his parents are full-blooded Cherokees, that would make him a full-blooded Cherokee as well, not a black or a mulatto, because mulatto, they were using it again. We already read it in Africans and Native Americans that it means almost like a mixture, a mongrel, whatever they saw, you know, whenever they saw people of different nations mixing. In this case, his
But wait
parents are
for it.
full-blooded Cherokee, so he is not a mulatto in their definition at that time, and he is not black. He
Nope.
is
Nope.
color,
He's not.
copper color, and they tagged him as black, right? You're not a crayon color. So 1930, so let's go over it again. 1880, mulatto, 1900, black, and then now 1930, full-blooded Cherokee parents. That makes him a full-blooded Cherokee. And you see the scribble in the color, all right? Now look at this as well. I want to back up a little bit. Now, after his family, Guy Spalding's family, his Leora, his daughter says Mitchell. Remember Mitchell, another common name around this area. And you can see there's scribbles on their color. Who knows what that means? But also you can see that right when they get to the Mitchell family, W. Mitchell, again, there's a scribble right where it would say full-blooded Cherokee or North Carolina. You can see that it said something else before, and I can see, let's close in, I can see the exact same B, full blood, and I can see that it said full-blood Cherokee before, and they just started switching it to North Carolina from there on. All right, you see how slick they are? All right, now I just want to show you one
That's
more
not even
thing.
the end of it.
All right, so this is Mr. Spalding's death certificate. Now I just want to show you this is from 1936. It says he would be 86. So in 1936 minus 86, that would bring us to 1850. Again, he could almost be turning 87. So again, that would mean that he was born in 1849, and we are talking about the same person. And it says here that sex male, color or race Negro, wife Delphia Spalding. So we are talking about the same person, and I want you to see how real this is, how this one example, this one person went through so many classifications through his life in these census records, so-called census records, right? How they tagged him mulatto, black, then he's full-blooded Cherokee. Now he died a Negro. You see, he died a Negro. And how common is this? Does this sound familiar in your family? So I just want you to have a foundation. That's why I'm showing you this. Thank you, Kiowa, for sending this record so we can share with the whole tribe.
And there's been a very similar process up in Canada. The whole status Indian thing. Does the government give you permission to be Indigenous or not? It's the government of England at that.
This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee, since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew.
Manasseh ben Israel declares that the Indians of Mexico had a tradition that their magnificent place of worship had been built by a people who wore their beards and were more ancient than their Incas. In the Universal History of 1748, it is affirmed that the Mexicans and other American Indians brand their garments in order the more effectually to express grief, the Hebrew custom of this day. Lopez de Gomara states that the Mexicans offer sacrifices of the first fruit, and when Cortés approached Mexico, Montezuma shut himself up for the space of 8 days and fasted in prayer. Emmanuel de Moraes and Acosta say that the Brazilians marry their own tribes and families, and Escorbatus affirms that he frequently heard the southern tribes repeat the sacred notes, Hallelujah. Malvenda states that several tombstones were found in St. Michael's with ancient Hebrew characters. When the Spaniards invaded Mexico, the Cholula was considered a holy city by the natives, with magnificent temples in which the high priest Quetzalcoatl preached peace to man and would permit no other offerings to the Master of Life than the first fruits of the harvest.
And I'd like to now bring up another interesting place that you're finding descendants of the Israelites. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. You know, so what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today who are white, Caucasian people came in a little bit later on. We know they were sold into slavery. We know now that they're fulfilling prophecies by saying, we're coming back, we want to rejoin the nation. We know that some of the greatest sages of the transmission of the Torah were converts from Rome. You have a man named Onkelos who wrote a commentary on the Torah, unprecedented, that we still learn today. He was a convert. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. So here we are, we're Caucasian Jewish people.
Go and have a look at Jewish literature to see what they say about their origins. And here we see 3 quotes. And the first is in the 1925 Jewish Encyclopedia, which says that Esau, Edom, is modern Jewry. And of course this is contrary to what most people believe today, which is that the Jews are God's chosen people because they are the Israelites. But here the Jewish literature is saying that they are actually from the tribe of Edom, not the tribe of Israel. In the Jewish Almanac in 1980 it says, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite or Hebrew. And that's because, truthfully speaking, they're not the Hebrews or Israelites, they're really the Edomites. And also we see here in the Encyclopedia Judaica that Edomite Jews began to call themselves Hebrews and Israelites in 1860.
And there's a whole big bunch of stuff going on in the 1800s. Remember, we get the letter J into the English and the French languages. And then in the 1860s, the European Jews start calling themselves Israelites. And late 1800s into the early 1900s, the artifacts, which have Hebrew writing on them and Ogham writing indicating Yahweh, well, those are getting covered up.
Old New World Order pledge to Jews. Give a look at the article. Arthur Greenwood, member without portfolio in the British War Cabinet, assured the Jews of the United States that when victory was achieved, an effort would be made to found a new world order based on the ideals of justice and peace. Arthur Greenwood, who was a deputy leader of the British Labour Party. Give a look at the rest of the article.
You get the Balfour Declaration, 1917.
New World Order forecast. When we have achieved victory, as we assuredly shall, the nations will have the opportunity of establishing a new world order. There you go. New World Order pledged to Jews. New York Times, October the 6th, 1940.
And the thing is that you had that Balfour Declaration, 1917, and then up here in Canada, in the 1920s, the Indian Act, which is foreign legislation governing Indigenous people, was, in through the 1920s, made much more harsh, right? Banning the traditional ceremonies, banning the language, compulsory re-education in the death camps of the schools.
November 25th, 1940. Jewish terrorists, organized by the Jewish Agency, which would later become the Israeli government, sank the SS Patria off of Haifa. The ship was full of Jewish refugees. The bombing killed between 282 and 267 people. Not all the bodies were recovered. It also injured 172 more, and there were 50 British crewmen among the dead. The paramilitary group Haganah, which later became the IDF, and Irgun terrorists bombed the Patria on the day it was leaving with the Jewish refugees. The people had survived Hitler's Europe, only to die at the hands of wicked Zionists. And until it was revealed who had done the bombing, the first story put out blamed the British. And later the story became that the refugees, saddened to leave, had bombed it themselves.
Wow, how sad must they have been?
The Jewish terrorists blamed the victims. The Haganah role was finally publicly disclosed in 1957, when Munya Mardor, the operative who had planted the bomb, confessed of his activities in the Jewish underground. He recounted, "There was never any intent to cause the ship to sink. The British would have used this against the Jewish population and show it as an act of sabotage against the war effort." Great apology. Never mind murdering so many people, because it would be bad PR. Some leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine argued that the loss of life had not been in vain, as Patria survivors had been allowed to stay in the country. Think about that. It was okay to kill a bunch of people, including children, so long as it made other people remain in the country.
And we have to remember that this is the princes of the Jewish people killing, well, I guess Jews that aren't good enough to keep breathing, right? I mean, they're not Jewish enough for the princes of the Jewish people.
Note that none of these people were from Palestine in the first place. They had come there from Europe. British authorities were deporting them from Palestine to Mauritius because they lacked entry permits. The Haganah claimed to have miscalculated the effects of the explosion. Well, the bomb blew a 6-meter hole in the ship, which turned sideways and sank in less than 16 minutes. Hundreds were trapped in the hold and drowned. It was so important to these Zionists to create a majority Jewish demographic in Palestine that they were willing to attack Jewish refugees on the day they were set to leave. It was worth the risk. Ironically, it was Palestinian Arab ships, along with the British, who rescued the survivors. Ergun first tried unsuccessfully to plant a bomb. Then Haganah planted a bomb on November 22nd, they claim, but it did not detonate. So on November 24th, they smuggled in a second bomb, this one larger than the first. And on the 25th, when the ship was full of passengers, they blew it up. Munya Mardur smuggled both bombs in the same way. He used a leather sack, commonly being used to carry lunches of workers, to conceal the bombs. His
British project, the Showan Indians, it says here the Showan Indians were found in North Carolina when Sir Walter Raleigh, or Sir Walter de la Raleigh, Sephardic Jew Moor, military expedition visited in 1585, 1586. At that time, they were documented as the Showanuk or Shawanoki. Later, the name was shortened to Showan, and today the Chowan River is one of the few rivers left that memorializes the native tribe on the eastern seaboard. According to Rovelane's Raleigh's expedition leader in 1585, the Shawanoke had 19 villages, with the capital being the town of Shawanoke near present-day Harrisville and Hertford County, North Carolina. They were the most numerous and most powerful of the Algonquin tribes in North Carolina.
The Algonquin.
Right? They were Algonquin people, just like the Matamusket we got the other day. So they kind of like related to the Matamusket, the video we did recently. All right, so if you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check it out. All right, how they all were also misclassified and labeled people of color. All right, now again, this.
Here we are again, the Algonquin, the Hebrew speaking. Pay attention to what happens to these people.
Tribe here, the Showan, Wepemok, the Wepemok, original name as they were said before, were Algonquins, and they had traveled, down. They had settled there, and again, they're saying at least 1,200 years. It says Lane described the town as being large enough to muster 700, 800 warriors, which meant that their total population was likely more than 3,000. Another later account by Harriet from the same expedition estimated that all the villages could muster 800 warriors. Lane's account was quite accurate in terms of his description of the town, its location, and structures.
So,
archaeological
tens of
excavations at the
thousands
site
of people.
Shawanoke in the 1980s confirmed Lane's report of its location. The town had been occupied by humans for 800 years, with radiocarbon dating established 825 AD. All right, so we just came back from the other website where it was saying at least 1,200 years. All right.
Then he's telling you that the Algonquins spoke perfect Hebrew as their main language. Perfect Hebrew, not a flaw, all right?
Yet the terms of 1677 settlement with the English set the Shawans on the path to political collapse and led to the surrender of all their land claims. In the 1677 treaty, terms transformed the Shawans from a self-governing collective into tributary reservation Indians under the authority of the colonial government. Noting the political decline of the Shawans through the 17th and 18th centuries, William S. Powell, in his time-tested narrative of North Carolina history, assumed that the Shawans were extinct by 1820. All right, they said you were extinct. They assumed. You think they only assumed, or did they do that on purpose? Paper genocide, huh? In reality, As this article shows, Showan descendants continue to live near their homeland after this point, and few Showan descendants still live on the lands once part of the Showan reservation. Modern historians have overlooked Showan persistence because the local government classified Showan descendants as colored persons instead of Indians. Oh, wow, really? They did what? They classified American indigenous people, right? Showan descendants, Weepemoc, the Weepemoc descendants as colored persons, so-called Negroes, instead of Indians during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. All right? It's not me saying that. We ain't making this up. Since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people, documented simply as people of color. Again, since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people, documented simply as people of color. And its Creek Reservation boundaries, Hitter contended that the colonists owed the Showans this settlement of the boundaries. After the Showans had suffered great losses in supporting the colonists against their Indian enemy, the Tuscarora, all right, he clearly understood that the original agreement between the Showans and colonists guaranteed the Showans a 12 square mile reservation. Nevertheless, he was willing to accept 6 square miles if clearly allotted. After decades of ignoring the Showans' appeals, the Colonial Council granted Hitter's request and ordered a survey of the reservation tract. Without scruples, the colonial government allowed a survey that pushed the Showans onto the worst acreage of the original land grant. You see what they did? They gave them the worst part of the land. They just pushed them there. Here, you guys get to keep that, when they were the original owners, as you can say, but they weren't really owners because the Indians didn't own land, but they were the original inhabitants of that whole area that the Great Spirit gave to them. Hawa. But now they're being pushed onto the worst acreage of their original land grant. Following the survey, Hitter complained that no part or parcel of G-said land and G-said tract laid out will produce corn, being all pines and sands and deserts. They can't even grow there. You see what they did? This was a problem because the land grant for the reservation required the Showans to pay a yearly tribute in corn. So they couldn't even do their tribute because they're putting them in this desolated part of the land, right, where they can't really grow. So they're already setting up for failure. You see what they're doing, right? They're trying to exterminate them. They're being slick. They know they ain't going to be able to grow there. Yep. They're stuck in the worst part of the land, and they're still going to owe corn where they can't grow. They're setting them up for failure. You see how messed up this is, right? He also believed that the tract surveyed was not near 6 miles square. Although the Showans held only the worst part of their original claim after the survey, neighboring colonists, all right, continued to pursue additional parcels of the reservation. So the involvement of local courts in Showans disputes dealt a severe blow to Showan political sovereignty. But the local court determination to invade Showan home life caused the complete collapse of Showan independent political activity. After the Bennett sold significant parts of the Showan reservation during the 1760s and early 1770s, the Showan County Court began to take Showan boys, all right? They began to do what? Take the boys, the indigenous boys, from their mothers and apprentice those boys to local whites or local Europeans. Apprentice, local Europeans. Apprentice, indentures, not slaves. See, in history, they will be known as slaves. With the apparent removal of the Bennett men from the reservation in the 1770s, the reservation was depleted of Showan men. You hear that? They took all the men. Remember earlier I said, so what happened to all the men? Why is there only women and children, you know? Look what they were doing. All right, apprenticing, just like the Madamasket, they were trying to give them a job, give them a profession, make them servants, give them a trade. It might have been family members they worked for, an apprentice, you know, but what I'm trying to show you is that eventually these people would be known in history if they were considered so-called black or dark-skinned as Negroes from, you know, coming from Africa, you know. That's what they would classify them. And that's what they did classify him when they was telling us history when we were young. With no men on the reservation, local officials may have believed that the time had arrived for them to play a paternalistic role and take over internal reservation affairs. In 1772, the court bound James Robbins' son, Anne Robbins, to Dempsey Hinton. This practice persisted into the national period. Listen to this, under the administration of the Gates County Court, because you might find this when you're doing genealogy, you might find records like this. And I have found records like this when I'm doing people's genealogy. It says this practice persisted into the national period under the administration of the Gates County Court. During 1779, the Gates County Court bound Benjamin Robbins to learn the art of plantation business. Oh, they bound him so he can go to college.
You'll
basically.
learn by
You got
doing,
bound
boy.
to go to college, learn the plantation business, because you're gonna have one soon, son. Under James Garrett Sr. Less than 2 years later, the court placed Benjamin Robbins and Elisha Robbins under the care of Jethro Miltier to learn an unspecified trade. That same year, the court also bound Joshua or Joseph Bennett, Joshua, Joseph Bennett, all Hebrew names, and George Bennett, each described as an Indian boy, in order to learn the trades of shoemaking and barrel making. Into the 19th century, the court forced other Chowan boys into similar arrangements, all right?
Into the
Doing this to
1800s.
indigenous people, all right?
And then in the 1800s.
And also children of some of these Sephardic people, because
in the 1800s, the first residential schools show up in Canada. And I suspect this will be when the first Indian boarding schools show up in the U.S. too.
they were mixing in with, females, indigenous women. So, a lot of them, again, it's both. These apprenticeships symbolize to Showans and Europeans alike that the local government had full political power over the Showans. Historian Margaret D. Jacobs has argued that removing children from their families allowed officials to punish Native people for past resistance, all right? Because these people were in resistance since the moment these Europeans got here. They were punishing them all these years, selling their land, making them Christian, giving them the worst part of the land and, places where they couldn't grow, disfranchising them, calling them colored. The boys' apprenticeships crippled the Showans' ability to maintain independent households and challenge Showans' women's parental rights and claims to their children's labor. Political domination, however, did not represent the total collapse of the Showans. Connections to one another, even with the end of their political independence, at least one Showans and their descendants retained bonds of kingship, alliance, and shared homeland. Even during the early 20th century, Gates County residents still understood that names such as Indian Neck were attached to a people, and that the descendants of those people still lived in the vicinity. In 1905, Congress approved the creation of a fund for members of the Eastern Band of Cherokees. Thousands of claims came to the attention of Gion Miller, whose office sorted through and then approved the rejected applications, right? So they had to apply to be Cherokees. That's what I be telling people. Sometimes it could be a general term. A lot of people who weren't Cherokees eventually claimed Cherokee.
Algonquins.
Among these were over a dozen claims from individuals from Gates County, all right, Chowan people. The names, these were Algonquin Chowan people, right? Not Cherokees, but they were trying to get at least into the Eastern Band of Cherokees.
Anishinaabe.
The names Chowan or Chowanoke appear to have disappeared from the collective memory of Gates County descendants. And as in many cases of people of Native descent in the Southeast, the name Cherokee, all right, became their tribal affiliation. I told you, this happened to many people in the South. That's why we only got Cherokee and Blackfoot as the general, like, my grandma's Cherokee or Blackfoot, but there's a broader, there could be so many things into saying Cherokee or even Blackfoot, all right? It became their tribal affiliation, but it really wasn't. Cherokee appears to have become synonymous with Indian for most 19th century North Carolinians who had long forgotten names like Chowan, right? Chowan, right? So what is it telling you here? Are you really Cherokee? Remember, Cherokee that word wasn't around before Europeans. Although they had no awareness of a connection to the Chowan or Chowanoke names, the Chowan descendants who applied for Cherokee benefits provided details of their heritage, some of which are at least partially confirmed by other documents. All right, so even though they were applying, they're like, look, we're Chowan, but we need, we want to be recognized at least as some native. The Chowan descendants were adamant about their native heritage and provided Guion Miller with detailed information about their history. Little did they know that the stories they told were not about Cherokees, but Chowans. In 1907, Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins. So they were they didn't know either. Okay, so I get it. These applicants were actually, they just thought they were Cherokees, but little did they know they were actually Chowans. This is what I was saying. A lot of people think they're, Cherokee, but they could be a lot other tribes, from the East Coast. But Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins, one of the petitioners in the Indian Town dispute 86 years before. She named her father's siblings, some of whom also appeared on that petition. Confident that she was a descendant of native people, Betsy expounded, if I have failed to state any of the necessary things in my application, and you will let me know what is necessary, and I can of right establish the point, I shall be glad to do so. She invited the commissioner to her community to take a look at me, and aware that the word of people of color in the South was not always taken seriously. Further suggested that the commissioner could confirm the facts from the white people of this county. Oh, Betsy knew that Chowan descendants as well as whites were cognizant of the histories of the native descendant people in her community.
North American Indians affords also a striking proof of the ceremonial law and stamps them at once in one respect, at all events, different from all other savage tribes of which we have any knowledge. What are, I may ask, the characters of these people? On the discovery of America by Columbus, nearly 2,000 years after the dispersion of the Hebrew tribes, the whole continent is found peopled not with a race of wild men, of cannibals, of savages, but with a race of intellectual, moral, innocent persons, divided into many hundred nations and spread over 8,000 miles of territory. I swear to your majesties, said Columbus, writing to Ferdinand and Isabella, that there is not a better people in the world than these, more affectionate or mild. He's talking about you, so-called Negro. They love their neighbors as themselves. Their language is the sweetest, the softest, and the most cheerful, for they always speak smilingly. Major Long says they are the genuine sons of nature. They have all the virtues nature can give, without the vices of civilization. They are artless, fearless, and live in constant exercise of moral and Christian virtues. Christian dodge the hijack, though they know it not. Charleville gives his testimony in their behalf. They manifest, says he, much stability in their engagements, patience in affliction, and submissive acquiescence in what they apprehend the will of Providence. In all this they display a nobleness of soul and constancy of mind, at which we rarely arrive with all our philosophy and religion. So he's saying the Indians display a nobleness of soul, Rasta got soul, you know what I mean? And constancy of mind, at which we rarely arrive with all our philosophy and religion. He's talking about the Europeans. They don't ever get to that state of nobleness or constancy of mind. Duprat contends that they have a greater degree of prudence, faithfulness, and generosity than those who would be offended with a comparison with them. No people, says he, are more hospitable and free. Bartram, who lived many years in the Creek Nation, says, joy, contentment, love, and friendship without guilt or affectation seem inherent in them, or predominant in their vital principle, for it leaves them but with their breath. They are, says he, just honest, liberal, and hospitable to strangers, considerate and affectionate to their wives, children, and relations, frugal, persevering, charitable, and forbearing. Who are they? Men do not grow up like stones or trees or rocks. They are not found in herds like wild animals. God, that made man in his own image, gave to the Indians an origin and parentage, like unto the rest of the great family of mankind. The works of his own almighty hand, from whom them did our red brethren, the rightful owners of this continent, descend. Thus the hijack red, copper-colored tribes of America. If the Indians of America are not descendants of the missing tribes again, I ask, from whom are they descended?
Good
So you
question.
see, it goes on and on. They're trying to figure out who you are. And again, Drop Nation, if they cannot tell you who you are, how can they tell you who you're not? They are so intrigued. They are so confused. You know, they want to know so bad. Who are you? Who are they descended from? The Egyptians? You know, where was ancient Egypt? America. So maybe
Potentially.
where in their beliefs is there at least resemblance to the worship of Isis and Osiris, or the hieroglyphics or historical reminiscence of that very ancient people? Are they part of the fierce Scythians? Their warlike propensities would prove them to be so, but where among the barbarians do we discover the belief in one great spirit, together with the softer virtues, the purity and talents of the Indians? Are they of the Tartar race? Their complexion, the shadow livery of the burning sun, might be offered in evidence. They have not the flat head, the angular and twinkling eye, nor the diminutive figure of the Chinese or Tartars. The Indians have distinct Jewish features, and neither in mind, manners, nor religion bear any affinity to the Tartar race. I have endeavored to show this by their traditions, by their religion, by their ceremonies, which retain so much of the ancient worship. But there is one proof more, which in my mind removes all doubt. Sir Alexander Mackenzie, in his journal on a tour to the northwest continent of America, declares, from his own observation, that the Chippewa Indians practice circumcision, which fact is corroborated by several other travelers amongst the various tribes.
And who are the Chippewa? Well, but they're also called the Ojibwe, depending upon which side of the border you're on. More generally, the Anishinaabe or the Algonquin-speaking peoples.
A general called Jeffrey Amherst, and Amherst, Nova Scotia is named after him. He was a British general who conducted germ warfare against the Mi'kmaq Indians in Nova Scotia. And in the 1740s, he kept a journal of this. And he was so brazen, he didn't hesitate to record what he was doing in the journal. Again, because they didn't figure they'd ever have to answer to anybody since they were the law. And in it, he describes how they would go into hospitals where their own people had been dying of smallpox. And they took the blankets and he gave it to one of his subordinates, a major, who then took it out among the Mi'kmaq and the other Indians who were allied with the French, like the Huron and the Algonquin-speaking Indians. And
the Algonquins again.
They were targeted. In fact, most of the Huron were exterminated by smallpox. So they were openly admitting that they were doing this. And all up and down Vancouver Island, you have stories of the same thing happening, although happening through the missionaries primarily, because they were the first ones into the area. Harriet describes in her village a little place called Claus near Port Renfrew on the west side of Vancouver Island. She says in the 1860s there was 3,400 people there. By the 1890s there were 44. So it had gone from over 3,000 people down to 40 some odd people. 98.5% of the population gone. And that was mostly from smallpox. And their people say that missionaries and British sailors had been dropping off these blankets to them that were laced with smallpox, and that's how so many people died. You don't get that many people dying, kind of accidentally. Somebody caught a cold one day. I mean, that is the way those things happen. It was germ warfare.
Tuberculosis was another weapon in the arsenal of germ warfare used against Native people in Canada. A fiercely communicable disease, spread quickly by air and contaminated food, tuberculosis was responsible for many of the deaths of children in Indian residential schools across Canada. According to government officials like Dr. Peter Bryce, residential school staff deliberately and regularly exposed healthy Indian children to tuberculosis by forcing them to sleep and play alongside children dying of the disease, and then denying them aid or treatment. It was this murderous practice that was responsible for an annual death rate in the residential schools of nearly 50%.
We're in the same room with people who had TB. They didn't separate us.
Then we were forced to play with them. The nuns made us play with those kids. We didn't want to get sick either, but they were forcing us to play with those kids. And also, they made some of them sleep with the other kids too.
The interesting thing was at the University of British Columbia, where I began to study for a doctoral degree, I began to find these records from a report by a guy called Dr. Peter Bryce. Who, he was head medical officer for Indian Affairs. And in 1907, he went on a tour of all the schools out here, like on the coast and in the prairies. And he found that he claims that over half the children were dying every year from tuberculosis. And specifically from a practice whereby healthy children were brought in and housed alongside children dying of tuberculosis, and then none of them were treated or helped in any way. They were left to die of this communicable disease.
Why?
Because they wanted to kill off at least half the children and wanted to cull the numbers down. And Dr. Bryce, I mean, this is not some flaming radical. He's an establishment doctor who's reporting back to his boss, the Duncan Campbell Scott, who was head of Indian Affairs. And he said in his report, the quote is, "I believe that conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious diseases." So he was clear. Children were being deliberately murdered by a practice of contaminating them with TB. That practice was referred to consistently. It's now even talked about in some of the mainstream academic books about the residential schools. So it's gradually being accepted, although it was reported on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen as far back as 1907. This is from Schools Aid White Plague. This is a discussion of Dr. Bryce's report. It's from November 15th, 1907. About 100 years ago, they said the average death in the residential schools in the West was 69%. So over 2/3 of the kids die after 1 year in these schools. That's talked about in the mainstream press, and yet today so many people are acting like, oh, we didn't know this. Well, I mean, it's been public knowledge for a century in Canada.
There was no intent to wipe out an entire people. Quite the opposite. The intent of residential schools, as best we could tell, was to help, to lift a community out of poverty, to help them succeed in an industrializing society, and to give them an opportunity with education.
Hi, my name is Watsuk. I'm an elder on the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, also known as Burrard Reserve. And I was incarcerated in a residential school for 10 years.
I'm Seamas. I'm with the Big Stone Indian Cree Band, Northern Alberta. I was incarcerated in residential school for 11 years, and I'm still fighting that process.
Now, a lot of people in Europe and other countries don't really understand what the residential schools were about. They don't even know that 50,000 children died in these places. Do you want to give a little description of what happened to you in these internment camps, really?
Well, if you didn't abide by their rules and regulations, it was supposed to be an educational purpose. That was the biggest lie in history. They didn't give us no education in there. All they done was just to keep us in there so that they could take control of the land and tell your parents that if you interfere, you may never ever see your children again. That was the whole story behind it. There's nothing to say that they took you there for education. I said, I can prove that. Out of the 46 of us from my hometown that were incarcerated there, not one person graduated. I went to a public school to get my documents referred to on what level my grades were. And they said, oh, you got the equivalent of a grade 3 educated person. And they said, now they advance you to grade 5, which you're still doing very poor. So there was no education. All there was the Bible on your desk. And when you walked in the main room, all they had on the front of the blackboard was, you're not an Indian anymore, you are one of us. So that just means that they were taking the Indianness away from us and to keep us as dumb as possible. They didn't want us, we couldn't speak our own language, we got strapped for it. If we tried to wave to my cousin there, she was in the other side on the residential school, and there used to be a sidewalk there. Whenever they walked on there, I tried waving at her, and I'd get whipped for that. And that's basically how they kept us.
And this is Orange Shirt Day. memorializing 4,120 children who died in the residential schools. And some of you are going, what, 4,000? Didn't we just say 50,000? Yeah, exactly. The government's own documents say that this process, which is going to take about 5 minutes, to put these names across the screen, this little ceremony should have taken over an hour. Are you picking up the holy name being sung? These were his children murdered by your state. And this ceremony is part of one of the greatest cover-ups that you will ever see. Every child matters. But most of them aren't even counted. This fake show of repentance and reconciliation is exactly the thing which you should expect to see in a nation immediately before God fucks it up completely and utterly. And there's a man who's sad to be giving up a pair of shoes. So those look comfy. He would have liked to have worn those. That's a 12th. At best, a 12th of those that should have been honored. Mocking God is never a wise decision. Speaking of mocking God,
I am here, in this land that,
listen.
along with its ancient memories, preserves the scars of still open wounds. I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry. Sorry for the ways in which, regrettably, many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppressed the indigenous peoples. In the face of this deplorable evil, the Church kneels before God and implores His forgiveness for the sins of her children.
He talks about the Protestant.
Well, there is absolutely no forgiveness there whatsoever. He's apologizing for what Christians did because people in power told them it was okay. But he doesn't say that the church was the one in power telling them that it was okay.
Protestants who were slaughtered, and much of it by the power of France.
In the service of
the
Rome.
Inquisition and the tools of the Inquisition, the axe that chopped off the head, then instruments of terrible torture, and they were mainly tortured for heresy. Now, what's the definition of heresy? Let's look in Article Heresy, page 440. Greek heresis, choice. Deciding for oneself what one shall believe and practice. That's heresy.
Refusing to bow the knee to
deciding
Rome.
for yourself was, in this time period of 1,260 days, was an act of heresy, was a sin punishable by death. That's pretty sad, isn't it? So taking away the conscience of man, setting up a power. Now, here we're going to have some very interesting things happening. These were some of the instruments they used. These were, for example, tongs that opened up and you put hot coals in them, and then you sort of modified the person who you were interrogating with these hot coals. These here are ankle guards or ankle clamps, and you'll notice the pins in them that when they were screwed tight, they went right into the bone. I mean, these people were pretty serious about what they did. This particular instrument was still used by General Franco in the 1970s. This is a pretty mean instrument. This is one where they put it around your neck, and then they start screwing that screw in there. Not very nice thing to do. Stocks, of course, thumb screws. This instrument was particularly nasty. They would hoist you up with your hands tied behind your back on a rope until you hang upside down in the air, and then they would tie this huge stone to your feet and throw it off a shelf, and it would go and tear your arms out of their sockets. These are pretty terrible things that they did in the Inquisition. And I know when
something in a language that I did not understand. When I told her in Cree that I did not understand her words, she slapped my face and yelled at me. When I again attempted to tell her in Cree that I did not understand, she slapped me again. I was so scared that I did not cry and marched like the other girls to the dining hall where we had oatmeal porridge with molasses, but no milk. I wasn't very hungry. That morning, I learned my first lesson on how to survive this place. Never say anything when being punished.
My hands were so swollen from my first day's strapping that I was unable to hold a pencil for a week.
Read properly, as Exhibits 141 and 142 reveal. These are financial statements from the Anglican St. George's School in Lytton, British Columbia, dated August 1946 and August 1947, 1 year apart. In 1 year, the money spent on food for the children has been cut by more than 50%, from $1,109 to $514, and fuel for heating the children's dormitories has similarly been slashed by nearly 50%. And yet, the surplus in the school budget remained at $3,688 at the end of that year, showing that lack of money was not responsible for this deliberate starving of the children.
Good to see the church was running a profit. Goddamn Anglicans, goddamn United Church, goddamn Catholics.
These murderous conditions led to continual escapes and attempted escapes from residential schools by the children. Punishment for escaping was severe. Exhibit 143 is a letter from the principal of the Anglican St. George's Indian School in Lytton, British Columbia, dated June 1942. Referring to his predecessor, he states, quote, "Two girls ran away, and they were chained together and driven home in front of the principal. They used the shackles to chain runaways to the bed. They also had stocks in the playgrounds, and they were used," unquote.
So the stocks were part of the Spanish Inquisition of the Catholics against the Protestants who believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father through the Pope, who had the stocks. Those same stocks are in residential schools, because the residential school system is part of the same persecution of free religion and free faith.
Thank you. Elders, colleagues, guests, thank you for this wonderful opportunity and honor to address you today. In talking to archivists, librarians, and other historians about my research on the so-called Indian hospitals, I was constantly surprised by an almost complete lack of knowledge that such institutions ever existed in Canada. I was intrigued by their reactions. Canada didn't have racially segregated healthcare, they told me. Yet when I spoke with people in Indigenous communities, everyone had either personally experienced the institutions or knew someone in their immediate family that had. So how to explain this apparent erasing of Indigenous experience from public memory? The boxes of archival documents, though restricted and difficult to access, were there in front of me. The bureaucratic record of the hospitals was mostly intact, though many patient files were destroyed in the 1950s. Yet 20th century healthcare history tells a progressive story of the road to Medicare that embraced all Canadians. It took me probably far too long to finally understand that the isolation and segregation of Indigenous people in Indian hospitals was integral to the dominant project of modernizing healthcare for non-Indigenous Canadians. On the rare occasion that Indian hospitals intruded into this story of progress, it was to congratulate Canadians on their humanitarianism. As Minister of National Health and Welfare Brooke Claxton put it when announcing the new Indian Health Service, or IHS, and Indian hospitals in 1946, quote, "Neither law nor treaty impose an obligation on the Dominion government to establish a health service for the Indians and Eskimos. However, for humanitarian reasons and as very necessary protection to the rest of the population of Canada, it's essential to do everything possible to stamp out disease at its source, wherever it may be within the confines of the country." And this would remain government policy for more than 30 years, that its only obligation to provide health care was a moral or humanitarian duty, allowing it to change policy frequently, which it did. Now, I'll use the term Indian hospitals throughout to reflect the historical usage that denotes the particular character of these institutions. And this deals with the constants of life and death, and the material is somewhat dark and disturbing. Imagine, if you will, a young Inuk boy sent from his Arctic village by ship, then alone by airplane, eventually reaching Edmonton's Charles Campbell Indian Hospital. None of the staff could pronounce his single name, so they simply called him Harry Hospital. After 7 years in hospital, or most of his childhood, he was woken one night and sent by train across the country to Ottawa with no chance to say goodbye to the only people he could remember. He spent many years attempting to reclaim his identity, his family, and his community. Imagine, if you will, undergoing lung surgery under local instead of general anesthetic. 16-year-old Dave Melting-Tallow spent 3 years in the Kamsel Indian Hospital, pictured here, and in 1959 underwent lung resection while awake. At a time when tuberculosis treatment for Canadians meant outpatient drug therapy, Indigenous patients were assumed to be careless in their health and spent many years in hospital, and many underwent invasive surgery before being returned to their communities. As Dave told me, quote, "They removed 3 ribs, and they removed part of my lung. Now I've got these stumps in my back on my left side and no ribs there. They used a saw. I was awake and I could hear the saw. They got part way and then they told me, now we're breaking the ribs off. When they did that, it felt like someone hit you inside the chest, and they did that 3 times. I just heard the saw buzzing away and cutting stuff." Or imagine the distress that would cause 2 Inuk women, dressed only in bathrobes and slippers, to walk out of the Parc Savard Hospital in Quebec City and into the February night. With 198 patients, the hospital had only 3 physicians on staff. The buildings were literally crumbling and were infested with cockroaches, fleas, bed bugs, mice, and rats. The women had been in the Indian hospital for 4 years, and with no one on staff who could speak their language, they assumed they would remain there forever, forgotten indefinitely. It's not clear where they hoped to go in bedclothes in February, but they could be forgiven for thinking they'd be better off somewhere else.
Anywhere else.
Now imagine being told that the Canadian government deemed all this necessary, indeed mandated, in order to contain the threat that Indigenous people pose to the national health. And that those in charge of this Indian health service were hailed as medical humanitarians in the service of a benevolent state. These are just a few of the stories that I found in the archival and oral history research for my recent book, Separate Beds. I also want to share today some images created by the gifted portrait photographer Joseph Karsh, who visited the Charles Kamsel Indian Hospital in Edmonton in 1952. To reproduce Karsh photographs is usually expensive and well beyond the means of an academic, but the Karsh estate asked only for a copy of the book in return for permission to use these images. His compelling portraits capture patients' loneliness and frustration. In the years surrounding the Second World War, Canada embraced a system of racially segregated hospital care, Indian hospitals.
So
22 of them by 1960.
After the
They were
end of
operated
World War
by the
II.
Indian Health Service, a branch of the Department of National Health and Welfare.
After
And
the
most were in
Holocaust.
borrowed buildings and redundant military facilities. But why now? Why in the 1940s? One reason was a shifting medical discourse. Doctors and bureaucrats had previously rationalized health disparities in Indigenous communities as a somewhat inevitable struggle with the challenges of civilization. Crudely put, the last gasp of a dying race. But by the 1940s, as First Nations presence increased in cities and towns, the medical discourse shifted from the dying race to a shrill medical rhetoric that focused on the threat and the danger that Indigenous contagion, particularly tuberculosis, posed to the nation.
So basically, after Hitler is dead, the peoples in Canada is making the same accusations against the Indigenous peoples that Hitler made against the Jews. That's our medicine. That's our history.
As Dr. David Stewart of Manitoba's Nanette Sanatorium warned, quote, reserves were not disease-tight compartments, and that Indigenous populations were not dying out, but, as he put it, quote, mingling with the general population. Indian hospitals were rationalized to isolate this presumed threat of tuberculosis, but unlike sanatoria, the accepted treatment standard for tuberculosis at the time, Indian hospitals treated all conditions, maternity, pediatric, including tuberculosis, based on race, not disease. As for racially segregated institutional care,
So, what would they do? Well, they'd take the pregnant mama and put her next to this guy who's dying from tuberculosis in the hopes that mom and the kid are going to catch it. That's an Indian hospital.
this had a fairly long history, especially in the West. In British Columbia, Chinese and Japanese patients in the early 20th century suffered in St. Joseph's Oriental Hospital. Community hospitals set aside basement Indian wards or Indian annexes. The Yellowknife Hospital confined Indigenous patients to its 10-bed Indian wing with a separate entrance and waiting room. So the color line in hospital care was drawn by community prejudice, but it was also maintained by Indian Affairs policy, where it consistently paid hospitals about 2/3 of what they charged for the care of Indigenous people. Not surprisingly, community hospital boards resented the practice and thus felt justified in providing inadequate care in basement wards or in refusing care altogether. So policy and practice actively shaped inequality and constructed an image of Indigenous people as less worthy of care. But at the two Indian hospitals established in the 1930s, at Fort Qu'Appelle in Saskatchewan in 1936, and Dynevor in Manitoba, Indian Health Service found that they could operate at half the cost of care in community hospitals. How this was accomplished is left to the imagination, but
And so what carried on after World War II was really just a continuation of what they'd been doing before.
we will see some of the consequences. Indian hospitals then were considerably cheaper than care in community hospitals if it could be had. This more than anything recommended the post-war expansion of the segregated hospital system. The subsequent Indian hospitals opened in the 1940s were in old military facilities such as North Battleford in Saskatchewan, Miller Bay near Prince Rupert in British Columbia, and Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, 22 in all. They were established on the premise, indeed the promise, that they would operate at half the cost of care in increasingly expensive community hospitals. But the large dormitory-style wards suitable for military purposes, treating only men, were completely inadequate for general hospitals treating men, women, and children. And we saw this Charles Campsell slide earlier. This is the rear and the wards. So the brick building is on the left-hand side there. The Indian Association of Alberta, though never asked for their input, at their 1949 annual meeting praised the Campsell Hospital's good work, but the association also voiced some concerns. Quote, "We see old people in the same wards as TB patients and children playing in the same rooms where old people are lying sick. We fear there's a great danger of infection spreading under such conditions." Their concerns were dismissed as the work of malcontents. But the hospital superintendent knew well that cross-infection was a constant problem. He cited the example of a young boy admitted for minor surgery. He had a middle ear infection, so surgery was delayed. When that infection subsided, he developed in turn chickenpox, measles, bronchopneumonia, rubella, and another ear infection. Unit 3 at the hospital, where women and children with all manner of illnesses were kept together, had developed into what the superintendent called more or less a pest house. Nevertheless, he judged the patients were still better off than in their homes. This became a common justification. Indian hospitals were not compared to accepted hospital standards, but rather to the patient's supposed inadequate homes, a justification also used by bureaucrats operating the residential schools. The ruthless economizing and overcrowding at Indian hospitals stands in sharp contrast to the millions invested at the same time by the same National Health and Welfare bureaucracy through the National Health Grants. Beginning in 1948 for 2 decades, the grants provided matching federal funds, $13 million annually, for provincial projects of hospital construction. In the first 5 years of the program, Canada added 46,000 new hospital beds. 30 new modern hospitals were added every year for a decade. Public funds aided hospitals to attract paying patients, while Indian hospitals assured Canadians that they would not need to share their modern hospitals with Indigenous people. Underfunded by design, Indian hospitals would never draw qualified staff or resources away from new community hospitals, with dire consequences for Indigenous patients. At the North Battleford Indian Hospital in Saskatchewan, in 1955, a 4-month-old infant admitted with severe bronchopneumonia, but whose condition, according to the physician, was fairly good, was found dead in his crib the next day. With one registered nurse and one nurse's aide on the ward of 14 seriously ill infants, there was neither the time nor the hands to adequately care for the patients. The accepted nursing standard at the time required 5 hours of nursing for seriously ill infants, but with current staff levels, they could only provide 2 hours. There's no evidence in the documentary record of any repercussions, and staffing levels remained the same.
Exactly where the government wanted them.
Putting racial segregation at the core of the nascent welfare state, Indian hospitals stood alongside their more modern white counterparts, literally. At Sioux Lookout, Fort Alexander, Manitoba, and the Blood Hospital at Cardston, Alberta, the Indian hospital sat next to the community hospital. And First Nations, many of whom welcomed the Indian hospitals as a belated acknowledgement of the treaty right to health care and as a first step towards improved health, found instead that the state's commitment ended with hospitalization, while reserve poverty, contaminated drinking water, and overcrowded housing continued unabated.
As state policy.
The Indian Health Service encouraged this vertical or treatment-specific approach to health services, and all but ensured continued health disparities. Hospitals treated those made ill by reserve poverty only to return them to it. Canada was consciously defining something called the national health that began with the health grants for hospital construction, and then national hospital insurance when even the middle classes couldn't afford the burgeoning costs of care, and finally, health insurance or Medicare. This is the familiar 20th century healthcare narrative, a progressive march from hardscrabble provincial plan to Medicare with heroes along the way. But the other familiar 20th century narrative, that is the continued and continuing health disparities in many, though not all, Indigenous communities. And while Canadians see these narratives as discrete and unrelated, my research explores how these narratives are intimately connected. Perhaps by remembering the history of Indian hospitals and racially segregated care, we can begin to see how our privilege came at such a terrible cost. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to stop it here, and we'll pick up again with part 2, just because this is running long.